Hey everyone, welcome back to Cells to Cell. My name is Heem, and this is Nick. This week we'll be talking about hematopoietic stem cells, otherwise known as HSCs. These are one of the two different types of stem cells. We've gone over MSCs, mesenchymal stem cells, and this week we'll be going over hematopoietic stem cells, HSCs.
Yeah.
So starting off, Nick, what do you know about HSCs that are different from MSCs?
Well, I know that they are found in the bone marrow. MSCs are also found in the bone marrow, but they have two completely different kind of jobs in that what's called stem cell niche, or what you would say where they are home to. But I know that HSCs, hematopoietic stem cells, and how they differ from MSCs would be that they are able to proliferate into any sort of blood cell. So that includes red blood cells, and that also includes all of our immune cells. So that would include neutrophils, basophils, eosinophils, that kind of stuff. Where you wouldn't think that, one thing about the blood that I don't think a lot of people understand, or someone who doesn't have a crazy background in biology and anatomy, is that blood is considered a connective tissue, and that it is literally all throughout our body. But it's not just red blood cells.
Mm-hmm.
It's a mix of the different types of immune cells that we have for our self-defense against any alien invaders, such as viruses or bacteria or fungi. And I think that understanding how MSCs can come from adipose or fat tissue, muscle cells, that kind of stuff. And that they're around the blood vessels, parasites. HSCs are, responsible for creating, what takes care of us, basically, the blood transporting the oxygen and everything protecting us.
Yeah, so, and we'll include a picture right here that you'll see on your screen right now, and it's basically splitting our HSC lineage in two main parts. You're going to have your myeloid lineage cells, and you're going to have your lymphoid lineage cells. So whenever your body needs something, your bone marrow hematopoietic stem cells will create either the myeloid cells or the lymphoid cells. And in your myeloid lineage, you have your megakaryocytes, you have your erythroblasts, you have your myeloblasts, and your monoblasts. And these are like the very, very last step of differentiation before you go into your actual cells, your mature cells. So as you can see from the top of half of the figure, you'll have your progenitors. And this is basically the steps and the cells that are your stem cells turn into before they turn into their mature cell. So you're going to have your stem cell, as you can see, which is it's a immature cell, and throughout differentiation and time, it will actually become mature into the cells that it needs to be. And on the right side, you can see the lymphoid lineage cells. This is going to be the kind of immune cells of your body, which also can derive from hematopoietic stem cells. So you're going to have your pre-T cells, your pre-B, and your pre-NK, which pretty much turn into, as you can tell, T cells, plasma, B cells, and NK cells. And these cells are responsible to keep you alive, fight off viruses, and all these things. And as Nick mentioned, a majority of them are found in your bone marrow. So if somebody has leukemia, you would want to give them a donor's stem cells from a HLA compatible donor.
Yeah.
So you take, and it's quite invasive to get these stem cells because you have to really put a needle in somebody's bone marrow and then extract it, and which would cause problems for them too. And then you have to make sure they don't get any graft versus host disease, which is an issue because when you put somebody, like let's say if you or I had leukemia, and that means our bone marrow has gone bad and we have a cancer, you would have to first put chemotherapy in my bones and get rid of all my bone marrow. We'd have to find an HLA compatible donor, which means that when you give me those cells, it's going to try reconstitute the entire bone marrow and try fix me, and it would basically not have to react or reject.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and graft versus host disease is one of the most important things when talking about, finding donors with stem cells and that kind of stuff. And it's the same analogy and use as, let's say, blood transfusions, total blood transfusions. So when we talk about HLA compatibility, really we're talking about, are my cells compatible with somebody else's? And the way that they test that is they look for different cellular markers to make sure that you check the right amount of boxes before you put it into you and it does not become toxic. That's the biggest thing, because graft versus host disease is really ugly. There are times where the body will even reject sometimes its own cells, through autoimmune stuff. And, it just turns into an awful disease. But one of the biggest things that I thought you mentioned was, where do we get these bone marrow transplants from? We've heard about bone marrow transplants. They've been around since, the 1900s, I believe in the 60s. They were even being studied back in the 1800s, originally. But the real question is, where do we get them? And, some people might think, oh, you go straight into the femur. No, we had a physician come in and talk to us in class a couple weeks ago, and he actually, has, drawn bone marrow from a lot of people. And what he had his people do was almost curl up in a fetal position on the bed, and from their back he would go in and insert the needle into what was called their iliac crest, or basically the top of the hip. And he would put lidocaine to numb the area, and then he said it would take him 5 minutes to get everything that he needed, and it usually was a little painful, but it's not as painful as a spinal cord tap, trying to get some cerebral spinal fluid. But this kind of, while it is invasive, it has been practiced for so long. And I also want to speak about when you said the chemotherapy stuff. So people who are undergoing or receiving bone marrow transplants, they have to receive chemotherapy, and a lot of people might ask why, you have the cure, why are you going to put the patient through, some pain and distress? The reason is the chemotherapy is going to go in, and what chemotherapy in a general sense does is it kills all dividing cells. So that's why people lose their hair. Mm-hmm. That's why people have no appetite, because the epithelial tissue or your stomach lining, which is constantly being changed and being renewed, all get killed. They get wiped out. But there's a good reason for that, because if you have a cancer of the bone marrow, you probably have some genetic defect that is not causing those cells, to be monitored. So going in and killing those cells means that as soon as you put the new bone marrow in, you don't want to be mixing those, because it's good if you put new bone marrow in, but if you still have cancer-causing cells, you're going to continue to have cancer. Yeah. So, stem cell therapy is great, but in bone marrow transplants and HSCs are amazing. They're amazing new novel technologies that, have been really deeply studied. But you got to understand that there's a lot that goes into it, before a cell is even put into somebody's body. And that's kind of what we're here for. We're here to show you that, the path from, being told you have stage 4 cancer to curing somebody. There are decades of research that go into it, and a lot of stuff that, a lot of people might never think of.
And I think it's an interesting little paradox, because, so let's say you give somebody a bone marrow transplant, and you have to keep them on immunosuppressed drugs, right? Because you have to wait until it's fully grafted and all these things.
Correct.
And when you immune suppress somebody, their body cannot fight off any bacteria or any infections. And when you give somebody a bone marrow transplant, you're basically reconstituting their hematopoietic stem cells. And these stem cells are responsible for creating your lymphoid. So it's just like you're suppressing their own ability to fight off all these infections, and then your hematopoietic stem cells can't even do what they're meant to do,
right?
As in fight off all these infections, and you could actually die from something simple like a cold,
exactly,
or a virus, which is quite awful.
Yeah, and immunosuppressed drugs, it does seem counterproductive. It really does, but also, what it's doing is when you put those hematopoietic stem cells into a body, you got to think of, you need to suppress the original immune system that's still existing in the body, if there are any cells, because those are still, programmed and wired to attack new things, right? To attack alien things that they've never seen before. So if you don't get rid of the old immune system, it's going to attack anything that's going to try to build a new immune system. Okay? And then if you do get rid of that old immune system, it's almost how much time does it take for these HSCs to start producing, a viable immune system for the patient? And I don't know the exact number, but I would assume that it would take, weeks, if not maybe a couple months, for somebody to stay in the hospital in a sterile environment, maybe even a negatively pressurized room, to make sure that they aren't going to catch anything like the common cold that could actually be devastating.
I think an important metric to also consider that you can't really quantify is quality of life, right? So somebody that gets these sort of transplants, living in a sterile room, having your loved ones, having to really be careful around you, can't even bring you goods from outside because they're not sterile enough. That quality of life impacts your mental health, and your mental health, your attitude on how things will go, is a huge determinant, in my opinion, of how things go. Like, personally, having experienced being in the hospital and being in septic shock and everything, it's just kind of like, you think that like you're literally dying and everything around you is just so negative. And sometimes you'll be, because like I was around 18, I was put on like a non-pediatric floor. So over there, like, the walls are white, you have nothing to see, the TV shows you some really boring stuff, you can't really, your friends come here and then, but it's just like really difficult to see the bright side of things. And I think when you see your family members come in and smiling at you and trying not to show you their tears and everything, that seeing their strength also gives you strength. So I think quality of life is a huge thing, and I think for the industry, I feel like speeding up engraftment processes, however it may be, is a big thing.
Yeah, but and again, it goes back to a whole kind of like paradoxical thing, because the way we want to speed up, let's say, bone marrow transplants, right, get that immune system back and up and running, if we were to put something into these cells to say, hey, go a little faster, who's to say that a couple cells are like, we're going to go fast and never stop, and then we just give the person cancer again. So, as awful as it is, and, I've had family members and I've known people who have been in hospitals who have to go into, awful conditions because of the condition that they are in, and it's horrible. But, it's just kind of part of like the science and like the biology of it, as sad as it is. And thinking about, bone marrow transplants, and even, people who receive, livers and hearts and when they're in need, and you talk about the quality of life, it's also the difference between like a bone marrow transplant, like kind of an organ transplant, in my opinion, is that like, if I were to give my bone marrow to heme, my bone marrow will grow back in a couple weeks. I couldn't get a new heart. Right? If I donated a heart, or it'd be, there's a lot of logistics that would go with that. But it's, and that's the thing, is we watch shows and movies, right, and that involve hospitals and involve patients and people who are sick. And one thing that I've kind of learned like from TV is like, those are just snippets. Right, when you see the family, like one of my favorite shows is House MD. I love House MD. I think it's a great show. With it being so unethical, makes it so entertaining to watch, and that's why it's so much fun. And I'm not saying that people should go out and have fun and break ethical code, not in no way, shape, or form. But you only get to see the snippets, and this isn't just for like medical shows and movies. This is for everything, for like even social media and stuff. You only see snippets. Right? So that patient who's been in the hospital recovering from something, the family can only see him during visitation hours or whatever, especially during COVID. Yeah. I had somebody in the hospital, I have a couple people in the hospital during COVID. And it's the lonely nights. Yeah. Right? Definitely. No one's there, besides like your nurse who comes in and checks your vitals every
couple hours.
Every 15 minutes to a couple hours, depending on which floor you're on. So, going back to HSCs though, and bone marrow transplants, as as isolating as it may feel as you're trying to grow and baby your new immune system, back into full strength, it takes time and it takes a lot of work with the patient and a medical team to really get that person up and moving again. But while it's all seems like doom and gloom, a new immune system can be life-changing. It can take, there are children who are born with a very faulty immune system, and they literally have to live their life in a bubble. And, imagine going to a parent and say, hey, like, your child might have to sit in a negatively pressured, sterile room for 3 months, but we can grow his or her immune system. We can give them a normal immune system through bone marrow transplants with, a good HLA donor. Those parents would do it in a heartbeat, no matter how much it costs. Because then it goes to the quality of life. Like, you're giving that child, a real chance to live and literally getting out of the bubble. So
I think what Nick mentioned is really important, because sometimes you'll have family members that are not HLA compatible with you. So sometimes you'll have a really unique member of your family where your mom, your dad, your sister, your brothers, and your children, let's say, aren't compatible with your blood type. This is a solution, I feel like, having these hematopoietic stem cells, especially if they can be sourced from umbilical cord or placenta. If somebody needs we actually learned about this in class the other day, okay?
Yeah.
So let's say one couple has one child, and that child has leukemia, so that means they have some sort of bone marrow cancer. Those parents knew about hematopoietic stem cells, and they knew that they're a rich source of them through umbilical cord blood. So what you can do is actually they planned on having a second child right away, and when that second child was born, they took the cord blood, the umbilical cord from that child, and then they saved their first child, their firstborn.
Is it a true story?
I think so, because
That's awesome.
Dr. Bonfield was telling about us in class, because it was just like, the strategy of doing these kind of things is so amazing, because if creating a new life can also save somebody's, it's like it's kind of like breaking the system almost. It feels almost like, is that even possible to do?
Yeah.
And it's insane because people don't know about the banking and everything, and we'll go over another video about the whole banking system and what you can do when you have a child. You can not only donate the placenta, but you can donate the umbilical cord, and there's a lot of amazing companies that are doing really cool things with this. But what's interesting to me is that, let's say somebody goes through a surgery and it's not bone marrow or any sort of cancer related. And this is a question for you, okay? If they had some sort of blood loss, okay, they were just profusely bleeding, it wasn't stopped enough, and if they didn't get a transfusion from somebody HLA matched, do you think it would be worth it to take an umbilical cord and differentiate them into erythrocytes and then give them a blood transfusion? So you're turning stem cells into blood cells and then giving it to them, rather than most using the potential for because these stem cells can be used to treat really bad cancers. So would you use an entire dose of stem cells to treat something that is just a normal blood transfusion?
Well, I think that it goes back into the banking question. So, I guess I'll give you a bit of some information about banks in this episode, but banking has, a couple different routes of how they can give out umbilical cords, and there's private banking versus public banking and that kind of stuff. But let's just say a private bank. So a private bank, what they do is they take umbilical cords donated to them, and they will cryopreserve them, freeze them in liquid nitrogen, and then hold on to them for X amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
And then once that X amount of time has run out, they will donate those to research, or they will pitch them. They'll throw them away as biomedical waste. And a ton of umbilical cords get thrown away every year. So my thing would be is, if somebody's HLA positive and has a lot of blood loss and, somehow survive and are stable, right? Like, that's probably the biggest thing is, like, are they stable enough for me to do a bone marrow transplant surgery? Like, that would be the biggest thing. But let's say they are. I would contact as many umbilical cord banks as I could, say, hey, I need an HLA, match right here.
They don't even need a bone marrow transplant. I'm saying in this situation, all they need is a blood transfusion. So would you be willing to use an entire dose of stem cells, potentially taking away from somebody who has cancer, just because you need a blood transfusion?
Well, I was going to say, is there anything that might be thrown out in the next month or two that you guys can do it with, since, and is there a way for you guys to differentiate these cells in a fast enough manner to get it to this patient? I don't know if I necessarily made any sense in that answer.
I think what Nick is trying to say, that, like, if something is going to be wasted anyways, and you know it's not going to be used for somebody like a cancer patient,
you might as well just use it.
Might as well use it for somebody who needs a blood transfusion, because if that is going to be medical waste anyways, I think that's a really good middle ground approach to this situation, because
it's almost like they need to do like a last call.
Yeah.
Like, hey, like, if anybody needs anything, this is, blood, umbilical cord blood banks are just going to go down the line and send a line out. It's going to
go waste and
it's going to go to waste
7 days.
Yeah, if anybody needs it for research, or if somebody's in need of something that they might be able to do, and again, it goes back to FDA. Has the FDA approved using umbilical cord blood, differentiating it into your erythrocytes, and then injecting it into somebody?
Yeah.
Right. That's the other part too, and I'm sure that they have. You can use umbilical cord blood, but that's an interesting question. And again, one thing I've learned going through school and learning about medicine and talking to physicians and nurses and stuff is, in medicine there is very rarely just a straight answer.
Yeah.
Right? Like, there's always variables that can change everything. One change of the wind can change, the entire situation, which, I don't know, that's kind of why I was asking a bunch of questions about that situation. But I think yes, umbilical cord blood could be used, but there are plenty of blood banks around the nation that I think that person could get blood easily. Potentially.
You never know. You never know. I feel like there's a shortage, especially when you mentioned the negative pressure control rooms that, to be honest, only exists in countries that are like developed in like America. When you go to countries like India, you don't really have these clean rooms because the environment isn't really good enough to maintain that kind of stuff. And I think there's a lot of changes that can be done, especially if you can take some of the research that's happening at Case and you can translate them to things abroad. I feel like there's a lot of things that can be done.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the HSCs are just as promising for, blood diseases and bone marrow cancers as, MSCs are. Like I said at the beginning of the podcast, MSCs and HSCs all work together. I was going to talk about the beginning, just like a little bit of anatomy and physiology a little bit. But what's cool is, we speak about MSC. I talk about MSCs and HSCs and how they work together as I continue to repeat myself. But, parasites on the blood vessels are able to read kind of what kind of blood's going through, how much blood there is, and all kinds of different metrics. Those parasites actually communicate with the nervous system, and we, as a lot of people may not know, we have nerves in our bones, right? We nerves are very much so integrated inside of our bones, and that's for communication. And when those parasites communicate on the blood vessels, it actually sends a message into the bones, and it causes HSCs to start proliferating or to downregulate, depending on how much blood there is. If there's any disease or any foreign invaders, it can tell, could kick HSCs into, instead of making erythrocytes, start making more white blood cells, in a young child who has a very formable immune system. And I think that that's really cool how, when we talk about these kinds of cells, we're not just looking at them under a microscope, right? When you look at them, you got to look at them in the whole sense of working with the entire body. And, just making that connection between the connective tissue of the blood, the nervous tissue, the MSCs, the parasites, everything, all just to go and say, hey, we need more blood. I think that's incredible. And, MSCs and HSCs are involved, and they both have different jobs, and they both support each other. And I think it's super interesting, just kind of how vast the body is, just in general. How amazing it is that nature just somehow created this, and I think it's remarkable.
And in the next episode, we're actually going to go over what the difference between MSCs are and HSCs. So far, you've heard us say MSC a lot, you've heard us say HSCs a lot. Now we're just going to really put it out there, where you can find each sort of cell, what their lineages are, and how you can source them, and what they're used for.
Yeah, so keep an eye out for that episode next week. And you got anything else?
No, that's it for this. That's it for this episode.
All right. Well, thank you for tuning in to Cells to Cell. I'm Nick Petrozzi, and that's him. Have a good one, guys.
See ya.